guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today we are going to be talking about my most disappointing books of the year and some of the books that I ended up DNFing in 2020. The discourse around worst books and most disappointing books has been quite wild this year. We don't need to go ahead and bring it up again, but it has been really interesting to see people sort of talk about why they do these kinds of lists, whether it's worst books or most disappointing books, however you want to frame it. I really go year by year and see if I want to do one or not. I think I didn't do one in 2018 because there just wasn't a lot of stuff that I read that I really felt like talking about that I didn't like. But for the most part, I do one of these videos every year since I started on BookTube. It's a choice that I make. I feel like this is part of what I want to put out there to you guys in being an honest reviewer. That doesn't mean that if you don't post these, you're not an honest reviewer. It's just what I want to do. And it's part of my whole being really upfront and open with you guys about what I'm reading, what I like, and what I don't like. So if you don't like negative videos, this isn't for you. Don't whine in my comment section about the fact that you don't like negativity. This isn't for you. I am never ever going to attack an author or readers or anything like that in these kinds of videos, and I'm never going to say you shouldn't and you can't read these books. I often find, as a lot of you guys do apparently when I did my slightly rambling video about negative reviews and about these kinds of lists, that these are actually super helpful. So just because I don't like something doesn't mean that you shouldn't read it. Hopefully you guys actually find something that you will enjoy from this list, and also hopefully you have read and loved some of these books. Just because I didn't literally means nothing. So this year I only have 6 books to talk about. I decided to include some of my DNFs here as well. I have gotten quite good at figuring out what I'm going to like and what I'm not gonna like, and avoiding maybe the hype for some books, and avoiding inevitable disappointments. So there's not a huge amount of stuff on this list, but these books I felt were quite notable, and they were ones that I found quite disappointing. So I have, let's see, I finished 1, 2, 3 of these books, and I DNF'd 3 of these books, so it's a pretty even split. I don't have like a worst book or a most disappointing book of the year. These are in no particular order. I'm just going to rattle through them and tell you why I did or did not enjoy these. So the first book on this list is A Big Ship at the Edge of the Universe by Alex White. I read this early on in the year, I think in January or February, with Amber from Books of Amber. It was one of our first buddy reads and we were so excited for it, and I think neither of us actually ended up liking it. There were a lot of reasons why I didn't particularly enjoy this one, but I think the main one was, for me personally, it just didn't feel particularly well executed. There were some bits that I did like, but for the most part it just fell a bit flat for me. So I'm looking on my Goodreads to remind myself what this is about, and looking at my review, I didn't write a review. So it's been a while since I read this, because I read this with Amber from Books of Amber as one of our very first buddy reads back in, I think, late January of 2020. So it's been a little while. And yeah, I feel like the fact that this book has faded quite so much from my mind probably says a lot. So basically we follow 2 female characters. One is named Boots, and she was a famous treasure hunter in another life, and an ex-soldier on the losing side of a war, and now she's kind of all washed up, and one of the things that she does is sells fake treasure maps to treasure hunters, which I actually think is quite awesome. So she ends up stumbling upon a very real treasure, and she has people coming after her. So then we have this character named Nyla, and she is basically a super famous race car driver, super privileged, born into wealth. She's very famous, she's very successful, and this strange event happens in one of her races where one of her rival drivers is murdered in the middle of the race, and she basically is framed for the murder. She has to go off and try to clear her name. They end up joining the scavenging ship and going after this treasure that Boots has discovered, which is basically like a super advanced high-tech warship somewhere lost out in the middle of space, and it's a race to find it because whoever does find it will become very wealthy indeed. So I think the best way for me to kind of describe what this book is like, it feels, and this is no shade to the author, I really don't want this to come across the wrong way, but it does feel a little bit like someone watched an episode of Firefly and was like, great, that's easy, I can do that, and then tried to kind of replicate that sense of fun and camaraderie and like banter amongst the crew, and I think that it just didn't work. This book doesn't have the charm of a book or of a series like Firefly. It doesn't have the kind of like rollicking fun adventure like I was hoping for. It has that, but it just doesn't. I feel like the treasure hunting kind of aspect of it and sort of that aspect of the plot just doesn't make any sense. I wasn't hugely impressed with kind of the villains who were coming after them, and I really didn't enjoy the kind of relationships between the crew members. So it was really disappointing in that aspect. I was really hoping for something that was super fun and really enjoyable, because a lot of authors that I really enjoy have liked this book. Nicholas Eames, who wrote Kings of the Wild, actually blurbed this book, and his quote was right smack on the front cover. And so I had some expectations going into this, and I don't think that they were met. Would I consider reading more from this author? Maybe. I'm going to keep an eye out on what they are writing, but I just really struggled with this book. It was hard. It was really hard to read something that should have been really fun and tried to be really fun and just didn't hit the mark. The next book that I have on my list is Wilder Girls by Rory Powers. This is a YA horror novel, which I was super excited about. As you guys may know, if you've been around here for a little while, I have been trying to dip my toe into the horror genre a little bit more. I really enjoy what I like from horror, and I'm trying to sort of like branch out and discover new things. So YA horror sounded like a great place to start. It probably wouldn't be too like horrific. It probably wouldn't have some of the themes that I don't enjoy in horror. And while all of that was true, I did not get on with this book. And I think, to be fair, this is a book that you will either love or hate. I don't think there's any kind of middle ground. I think that people who like this book really love it. Unfortunately, it just didn't work for me. So this book takes place at a school for girls that's kind of on an island off the coast of, I think, Maine, maybe? It's off the coast of the eastern United States, and it has been 18 months since this horrible virus broke out at this school. So it's something called the Tox, and what it does is it almost like disfigures and morphs the people and animals that it infects. So various girls will have various sort of different things happen to them. One has this almost like her arm turns kind of silver and claw-like. Our main character, her eye like swells shut and is, you know, basically useless. It's really horrible. All these kinds of like horrible things are happening. So they're basically just trying to survive on this island. They're completely cut off from their parents. There's no communication with the outside world. And then things begin to go even more wrong. One of the girls goes missing, and Hetty, who is our main character, will do anything to try to find her, even if it means breaking quarantine and facing the horrors outside. I think what disappointed me about this particular book is the fact that there was no plot and there should have been a plot. I do sometimes enjoy books that don't really have a plot. See my love of Record of a Spaceborne Few by Becky Chambers. That book has no plot. It wouldn't know a plot if it hit it in the face. But this book, I think, really suffered for that. I enjoyed certain aspects of it, but I don't think there was enough to really pull this together. I think that if you're going to write a book like this, it has to be really strong, and it just didn't really get there. Part of my trouble is the voice of the main character, so this is split into, I think, two perspectives. So we have Hetty, who is our kind of like main perspective, and then we have Byatt, who is her friend, I believe. And neither girl really has a strong voice, to the point where I actually couldn't tell their chapters apart. I really had to be paying attention to like make sure that I knew who I was following because ultimately didn't really feel like it mattered. It's also, I don't want to say too much, but it doesn't have a satisfying ending either. And I'm totally, again, I'm cool with open endings, but I do feel like there has to be some kind of satisfaction given to the reader, and it basically felt like the book just kind of ended. And I was wondering if like I was missing pages or something. This one, it was just, this is very, very clearly a book that was not for me. There's nothing really wrong with it ultimately, it's just it didn't line up with my personal tastes. I am very curious to read her second book, which came out, I think it's just come out in the UK here, called Burn Our Bodies Down or something like that. I'm very curious to see what that one is like because there were aspects of her writing that I did enjoy. It's just very clear that this was kind of a weird and maybe a little bit more experimental book that just didn't work for me. And the last disappointing book before we move on to DNFs was The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. I was so sad about this. And this is one where I think I am very much in the minority, so if this is on your TBR, don't fret too much. Everyone has been loving it. I am just, I think, one of the very few who did not. So The Year of the Witching is a really interesting one. It has a really, really great concept, and I think there was a lot here that had such incredible potential, but for me it felt like it lost its way a little bit. So we follow a character named Emmanuelle, and she is living in a town called Bethel, and it's it feels almost like a religious cult that she is living in. However, this is a fantasy world, and the witches that are sort of like the enemies of her religion are very, very real. So Emmanuelle, her mother ran off and was basically got into this horrible situation and was banned from the community, so she's never known her mother after that particular point. And one day she is gifted by these witches her mother's diary, and she learns a little bit more about her, and she learns that there are 4 plagues coming to Bethel, so she wants to try to stop this from happening. I really enjoyed the first, I think, 25% of this book. I really liked the setup. I liked the fact that we had this town where all of these things that these people were taught were very real, because that felt so different for me. Having the kind of like the religious cult with, you know, the multiple brides and the prophet and the religious teachings and all of that, something that you definitely see in the real world, but the fact that this was something that was actually happening completely and totally took me by surprise. I really, really liked that. I also enjoyed Emmanuelle's character at first, being kind of the person who's being ostracized, but wanting desperately to fit in, but knowing that she's very different. I really liked that, and I also really liked, I think his name is Ezra, who is the son of the prophet who kind of shows an interest in her. Where it started to fall apart for me is sort of like the second half of the book. I think what was wrong here for me was the pacing, because there is so much that happens that should have had a lot more pages dedicated to it. I feel like the story really needed to be fleshed out. So for example, we're gonna go into some spoilery territory. I'll put like timestamps and warn you guys before we talk about anything too spoilery. But there are certain points in the book where important things happen. She goes and she does a thing, and it will be like 3 pages, and then suddenly we skip ahead to a completely new scene and location, and I'm like, wait, what was happening there? That seemed like it was really important. And so it felt like it needed to be about 100 pages longer to really, really fill out this sort of like journey that she was on. I feel like the book would have benefited a lot from being longer. I also feel like as the book went on, it felt as though the characters were sort of losing sight of themselves. There were a lot of decisions that were made and sort of actions that were taken that felt very much not like the characters we met at the beginning of the book. They felt like different people, and they didn't feel like they stayed true to their own character, and that was very, very confusing and very strange. So sort of linking to that, I'm going to put a spoiler tag thingy on the screen, so you can skip to the timestamp on the screen if you want to skip me talking about the ending. I'll give you guys a second to go ahead and do that. I think where this was the most obvious was at the end, because maybe I'm just a grumpy old cow, but I'm really, really tired of the kind of merciful woman ending. At the end of this book, they go and she does the big battle, she defeats the witches, you know, the men of the village who have been like sexually abusing all these young girls are totally let off. And she basically almost like returns the town to normal. And why this felt so strange to me was she's not a merciful young woman. She has these diaries from her mother. She knows what they've been doing. Sure, the witches aren't like good, but she has been throughout the entire book constantly brought up the fact that women are paying for the mistakes and the sins of men. You have these young women who are in the stocks. You have these young women who are being raped and sexually abused. You have the kind of prophet who's taken on multiple wives, and he's just sort of like collecting any woman that he lusts after, and we find out that he's been raping girls who are underage. You hear about this throughout the entire book, and then Emmanuel at the end is like, it almost felt like she Pretty in Pink'd the ending, where maybe it went out to beta readers or something and no one liked the ending, so it was really hastily rewritten. What I expected from Emmanuel was to basically burn the fucking place down, take the women, and go. I did not like the ending. I hate that these female characters who are so kind of filled with rage and have been abused and put down and are witnessing the sins of the men around them are like, it's fine at the end. I really hated that so much. So I feel like this was a book where I enjoyed, and then that enjoyment really fell off of a cliff. I know that a lot of people have really loved this book, but it was just very much one that was not for me, especially by the end. So the first of the 3 DNFs that I wanted to talk about, unfortunately, is one of my most anticipated books of 2020. I was desperate to get my hands on it. I was so excited. I did a little happy dance when it arrived in the post. I made it about 100 pages in, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I know that I'm very much in the minority here, so again, if you have this in your TBR, definitely still read it. Let me know what you thought of it. This is The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. Oh man, DNFing this book was one of the hardest things I had to do this year in terms of my reading. I agonized for like 2 weeks about whether or not I was going to DNF this because I was so not enjoying it. But I desperately wanted to. The 10,000 Doors of January, if you have seen my Best Books of 2019 video, was my #2 book of that year. I loved it. I loved it so much. I've loved her short stories. I think she's a fabulous person. I love her writing. She's such an incredible writing style. I just think she's amazing. So why didn't this one work for me? I think, again, this comes down to personal preferences, especially with characters and character types. So in this book, we have 3 sisters. We have James or Juniper, you have your sort of regular name and then your witchy name, Agnes or Amaranth, and Beatrice or Belladonna. And all 3 of them have left their sort of rural countryside home with their abusive father separately, and they've gone to this town called New Salem. So Juniper is the youngest. She goes to New Salem after something bad has happened, and the 3 sisters end up reuniting and getting swept up in the suffragette movement, and they decide they are going to use their witchcraft to lend a hand to the suffragettes. Which sounds amazing. Like witchcraft and suffragettes. Brilliant. Great. It acknowledges the fact that a lot of suffragettes were not interested in the plight of women of color, which is a very, very true fact. There is a lot of really interesting stuff that is discussed in this book. So why could I not get through it? I think that this comes down to character for me. I couldn't stand any of the 3 sisters. It was really rough. So the one I think that I had the potential to like was Beatrice, who's quite sort of like quiet and bookish, but she didn't really I didn't give her a fair chance. She hadn't really done enough in the book at the point that I did DNF for me to really form any real thoughts on her. Agnes I really struggled with, I think just because I couldn't really relate in any way. She felt very shallow to me. But the biggest problem for me was Juniper. I really struggle with particular characters, especially sort of younger, sort of like teenage YA age characters, which Juniper is, where I hate the sort of shoot first, ask questions later kind of attitude of a lot of these characters. They just run headlong into situations without thinking. They're really fiery to the point of being real dumb. And I just like, I can't stand these kinds of people in real life. So when I have them in my books, I really, really struggle. And I wanted to smack Juniper over the head with a frying pan, sit her down, and just make her stop. I really, really, really struggled with her as a character, and I know that a lot of people love her. She's just so not my type of character whatsoever. So I didn't really give this book much of a chance, to be fair, but 100 pages is about where I tend to DNF books, so it got as much a chance as anyone else. I feel really bad because I love Alex Harrow's writing so much. I've read some of her short stories, I have read her other novel, like... I'm really, really disappointed. So hopefully this is a standalone book and I'm not going to have to like sit through an entire series before we get her next one that's not related to this world, but we'll see. I'm honestly like, this was so upsetting to me. So the next DNF that I had was an interesting one. I think this is just another one where I love the concept, but the execution was so weird that I think I just didn't really get it. So this is The City in the Middle of the Night by Charlie Jane Anders. I have a funny relationship with Charlie Jane Anders because I sort of like V.E. Schwab. I love her ideas in theory, but sometimes in concept it doesn't quite click with me. So I read All the Birds in the Sky and I thought it was fine. I really love the concept. I thought it was just fine. So I picked up this one knowing that I was getting a lot of praise. Around the time that I had picked it up, it got nominated for the Hugo for Best Novel. So I was like, okay, we're gonna do this. And I think I got 5 hours into the audiobook and I didn't care for it and I just set it aside. So this is a book that takes place on a planet called January. I actually don't remember it being called January. So this is a colonized planet that is divided with a permanent line. So one half is frozen darkness and the other side is blazing endless sunshine. So the only inhabitable area is like right on the line between the two. And we have these two cities that were built on sort of that teeny tiny temperate zone. And they are the sort of last bastions of civilization. But life is dangerous inside of them as well as outside. So we have Sophie, who is a student on kind of the wrong side of the city, who's exiled into the dark because she's part of a failed revolution. She basically gets caught by the cops, chucked out onto the dark side of the planet, and basically left for dead to freeze to death. But she ends up finding help from mysterious strangers, and she ends up sort of joining this ragtag group of exiles. I don't remember really anything about this book. I remember it being really weird, and I remember it just not really doing anything. I think it's really interesting in terms of sort of the science and the thought that had to go into a city like this. So for example, there's a very limited time of day that people can go outside because of the incredible blazing sunshine, even though they're in this kind of like teeny tiny temperate zone. There's like a curfew because people can't stay out at night because they'll like freeze to death. And that part was really interesting. Anything that had to do with the plot and the characters just did not hit the mark for me. I actually remember very, very little of this book, and I think that has to do with how little happened in it. And again, I don't mind books where not a lot happens. I don't mind books where there's like no real plot or anything like that, which wasn't the case here, but it's not like I need a really strong like action-packed plot to enjoy something, but I do need something to hook me in, and how interesting sort of the way that the city functions was just not enough to do that. So this will be an interesting one to hear from people who really enjoyed it, why you liked it, whether I should pick it up again and give it another try, because I desperately want to like Charlie Jane Anders' books. It's just that they don't really work for me. So the last book that I have to talk about, my last of these 3 DNFs, is Docile by K.M. Spara. So this is an interesting one. I think that the case with this was just a little bit too hardcore for me. I think that if you can kind of suffer through the extreme amounts of rape and coercion and all of the horrible stuff that happens, it's a really, really interesting commentary on capitalism and the juxtaposition between the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor. It's a lot. So some of the stuff that happens in this book, in case you need the content warnings, there are a ton on Goodreads though, if you end up wanting to check this out, is we have rape from the rapist's point of view, dubious consent, humiliation, degradation, confinement, and enslavement. This was a hard book to get through, and I do have some issues around reading sexual assault. I really, really struggle with it. But I can get through it if it's a book where I really feel like it's important for the plot that these things are happening. I don't know if quite all this rape needed to happen. It was really, really hard, especially sort of, I don't know if you could call it kind of Stockholm syndrome, but sort of like our main character, Alicia, really sort of identifying with his owner, Alex, and sort of I don't want to say liking it because that's not where I want to go with this, but sort of having that kind of dubious consent. It's a hard book to read. So in Docile, we have a world in which the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor have this incredible, like striking gap between them. And the incredibly poor can basically become docile, which is essentially selling yourself to become a sex slave to get your family out of debt, because debt becomes inherited. So say your grandparents are in debt, that debt is passed down to your parents and then eventually to you, along with any other debt that you accrue throughout your life. And of course, because this is a horrible system, people are basically going to be in generations of debt. But one of the ways you can get out of this is to serve for a period as a docile. So this is basically you sell yourself as a sex slave to the extremely wealthy. They buy up your contract, they pay X amount, and you are stuck with them for however long that is, 10 years or whatever, and you are given this drug called Docile, which does kind of what it sounds like. It basically makes you really fuzzy, you don't remember what happens, but it also makes you incredibly compliant. You do whatever your master says. So our main character, Alicia's family, has been absolutely ruined by debt, and his mother has never recovered from the use of this drug, which is called Dosaline, not docile. And so he decides that he is going to try to erase all of his family's debt, and he takes on this contract, a lifetime contract with this man named Alex, and he's also going to refuse Dosaline, even though Alex's family is the sort of family who created this drug. They insist that there's nothing wrong with it, that there clearly is. It has these huge, horrible side effects. So basically, Alicia refusing to take this drug is going to become the crowning achievement for Alex in his life. He's going to show that you can have sort of a docile without having this drug, and Alex is going to discover this kind of side effects and stuff like that. It's a hard book to read. It's a really hard book to read. So again, this comes down to personal preference. I feel like talking out kind of the content warnings at the beginning of the book is more than enough. You probably know why I didn't finish this book. If you want to learn more, you can go ahead and check out Goodreads. There are actually some very funny reviews of this book from people who had various sort of thoughts that were different from my own. But yeah, it was just a hard read. I couldn't get through it. So that is it for my most disappointing books and DNFs in 2020. I would actually really love to hear if you enjoyed any of these books, where some of your thoughts were a little bit different, and I would also love to hear if you were let down by some books in 2020 as well. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.